They say comfort is a velvet trap, a soft, warm cage that lulls a man into forgetting the wild beat of his own heart, the raw strength in his bones. It whispers promises of ease and security until one day the walls close in and he realizes he's traded his grit for gilded chains. And sometimes it takes losing every last stitch of that comfort to remember the true, unyielding power that lies within, to remember what it means to be truly free. There was a man like that. His name was Hector. At 48, he wasn't a young buck anymore, not by a long shot. He worked with his hands, a mechanic, the kind of man who could tell you more about the groan in an engine than some folks knew about their own marriages. You'd find him most days under a hoist at Hector's Auto and Tire, a small garage tucked between a laundromat and a liquor store in a part of town that didn't bother with fancy names. Hector carried himself with a quiet strength, like a mountain that had been weathered by 1,000 storms but still stood firm. His face, etched with lines that told stories he rarely spoke aloud, was a roadmap of tough times seen, battles fought, and lessons learned the hard way. He wasn't defeated, not exactly, but there was a certain world weariness in the set of his jaw, a slight slump to his broad shoulders that hinted at burdens carried for too long. His eyes, the color of worn denim, were observant, missing little, yet they held a deep-seated quietness, almost a stillness, that made you wonder what depths lay beneath the surface. His hands now, those were a testament to his life. Knuckles thick and scarred, skin permanently stained with grease and oil that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. They were the hands of a craftsman, calloused and powerful, capable of both brute force and delicate precision. He could coax a sputtering engine back to life with a touch, could feel the subtle vibration of a failing part through the metal. When he wasn't turning a wrench, he'd often rub the back of his neck, a silent gesture that spoke of the aches and strains of a body pushed hard, day in and day out. He wasn't much for small talk, not at first. A nod, a grunt, a concise answer to a direct question, that was Hector's way. But you'd quickly learn that beneath that gruff exterior lay a man of unwavering reliability, someone who'd fix your problem right the first time, and if you earned his trust, fiercely loyal. He wasn't the kind of man to invite you over for a beer, but if your car broke down on a freezing night, he'd be the first one to show up, no questions asked. His scent was always a mix of stale coffee, exhaust fumes, and that particular metallic tang of grease. It clung to his worn work shirts, to the faded cap he usually wore pulled low over his eyes, and to the well-oiled tools that were extensions of his own sturdy arms. He was simply Hector, the mechanic, a fixture in the neighborhood, a man whose presence was as reliable and understated as the ticking of an old grandfather clock. Character count check, tilde 4,000, perfect. They say comfort is a velvet trap. A soft, warm cage that lulls a man into forgetting the wild beat of his own heart, the raw strength in his bones. It whispers promises of ease and security until one day the walls close in and he realizes he's traded his grit for gilded chains. And sometimes it takes losing every last stitch of that comfort to remember the true, unyielding power that lies within, to remember what it means to be truly free. There was a man like that. His name was Hector. At 48, he wasn't a young buck anymore, not by a long shot. He worked with his hands, a mechanic, the kind of man who could tell you more about the groan in an engine than some folks knew about their own marriages. You'd find him most days under a hoist at Hector's Auto and Tire, a small garage tucked between a laundromat and a liquor store in a part of town that didn't bother with fancy names. Hector carried himself with a quiet strength, like a mountain that had been weathered by 1,000 storms but still stood firm. His face, etched with lines that told stories he rarely spoke aloud, was a roadmap of tough times seen, battles fought, and lessons learned the hard way. He wasn't defeated, not exactly, but there was a certain world weariness in the set of his jaw, a slight slump to his broad shoulders that hinted at burdens carried for too long. His eyes, the color of worn denim, were observant, missing little, yet they held a deep-seated quietness, almost a stillness, that made you wonder what depths lay beneath the surface. His hands now, those were a testament to his life. Knuckles thick and scarred, skin permanently stained with grease and oil that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. They were the hands of a craftsman, calloused and powerful, capable of both brute force and delicate precision. He could coax a sputtering engine back to life with a touch, could feel the subtle vibration of a failing part through the metal. When he wasn't turning a wrench, he'd often rub the back of his neck, a silent gesture that spoke of the aches and strains of a body pushed hard, day in and day out. He wasn't much for small talk, not at first. A nod, a grunt, a concise answer to a direct question, that was Hector's way. But you'd quickly learn that beneath that gruff exterior lay a man of unwavering reliability, someone who'd fix your problem right the first time, and if you earned his trust, fiercely loyal. He wasn't the kind of man to invite you over for a beer, but if your car broke down on a freezing night, he'd be the first one to show up, no questions asked. His scent was always a mix of stale coffee, exhaust fumes, and that particular metallic tang of grease. It clung to his worn work shirts, to the faded cap he usually wore pulled low over his eyes, and to the well-oiled tools that were extensions of his own sturdy arms. He was simply Hector, the mechanic, a fixture in the neighborhood, a man whose presence was as reliable and understated as the ticking of an old grandfather clock. He lived alone in a small, well-maintained house a few blocks away, its garage always tidier than the shop, tools gleaming on pegboards, a quiet testament to his order and his pride. There's a sly kind of blindness that comes with comfort, not the loss of sight, but the loss of vision. It makes a man believe the ground beneath his feet is solid because he's never had to dig a foundation. Makes him forget that true strength isn't what you're given, but what you build brick by painful brick with your own two hands. And sometimes it takes losing everything to finally see. Hector knew that truth now in the marrow of his bones. You wouldn't know it to look at him, not Hector the mechanic. 48 years old, his face a map of quiet determination, his eyes holding a depth that spoke of battles fought and lessons learned. When he bent over an engine, his movements were precise, deliberate. They were the hands of a craftsman, calloused and powerful, capable of both brute force and delicate precision. He could coax a sputtering engine back to life with a touch, could feel the subtle vibration of a failing part through the metal. When he wasn't turning a wrench, he'd often rub the back of his neck, a silent gesture that spoke of the aches and strains of a body pushed hard, day in and day out. He wasn't much for small talk, not at first. A nod, a grunt, a concise answer to a direct question, that was Hector's way. But you'd quickly learn that beneath that gruff exterior lay a man of unwavering reliability, someone who'd fix your problem right the first time, and if you earned his trust, fiercely loyal. He wasn't the kind of man to invite you over for a beer, but if your car broke down on a freezing night, he'd be the first one to show up, no questions asked. His scent was always a mix of stale coffee, exhaust fumes, and that particular metallic tang of grease. It clung to his worn work shirts, to the faded cap he usually wore pulled low over his eyes, and to the well-oiled tools that were extensions of his own sturdy arms. He was simply Hector, the mechanic, a fixture in the neighborhood, a man whose presence was as reliable and understated as the ticking of an old grandfather clock. He lived alone in a small, well-maintained house a few blocks away, its garage always tidier than the shop, tools gleaming on pegboards, a quiet testament to his order and his pride. The clang of the old alarm clock on his nightstand was Hector's daily anthem. 5 a.m. every single morning, 6 days a week. No snooze button, no fancy-sounding chimes. Just that jarring mechanical shriek that pulled him from sleep like a fish on a hook. He'd swing his legs out of bed, the old floorboards groaning under his weight, and shuffle to the kitchen. The coffee pot was always ready, prepped the night before, a habit ingrained from years of wanting to shave even a minute off the morning rush. While it brewed, he'd stare out the window, watching the streetlights still fighting the first hints of dawn, sometimes catching the newspaper delivery car whizzing past. Another day. Another round of oil changes, brake jobs, mysterious knocking sounds, and the endless symphony of impact wrenches and air compressors. His mornings were a ritual of quiet practicality. A quick breakfast of toast and black coffee, the day's newspaper spread open on the small table, though he rarely read beyond the headlines. It wasn't apathy. It was just that the daily grind offered little room for reflection on world events. His world was the garage, the customers, and the ledger in his head that tallied gas prices, utility bills, and the looming specter of the house payment. Every month it was a dance, a careful balancing act of parts costs versus labor, a constant whisper in the back of his mind. Don't mess up, don't miss a payment. The small house, though meticulously cared for, was a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen, and how hard he'd fought to get back to even this humble perch. He took pride in its neatness, the absence of clutter, a desperate attempt to control what he could in a life that had once spiraled so completely out of his grip. Sometimes, as he drove his old pickup to the shop, the first rays of sun glinting off the dew-kissed rooftops, a different image would flicker across his mind. Not of the current day's schedule, but of a sprawling green lawn, a different kind of house, bigger, grander, with windows that caught the morning light in a way his small windows never did. He remembered the feeling of waking up without an alarm, without the immediate pressure of the clock, the vague, comfortable assumption that the world would simply provide. That was the Hector before, the man who'd never truly had to strive. The memory was a dull ache, a ghost of a life he'd once thought was his birthright. It wasn't just the money he missed. It was the ease, the belief that he was somehow exempt from the daily fight. That belief, shattered into a million pieces, had left him with a deep-seated shame, a feeling of having squandered a gift he hadn't earned. He never spoke of it. Not to anyone. The few times someone, a curious customer perhaps, might ask about his past, he'd offer a grunt and change the subject, or just stare them down until they got the hint. The truth was, the past felt like a weakness, a testament to a softer version of himself he'd tried to bury under layers of grease and hard work. He'd learned self-reliance the hard way, but the old comfort still lurked, a siren song of what could have been, pulling at the edges of his resolve. That was his flaw, his quiet burden. The fear of vulnerability, of letting anyone see the raw, exposed part of him that still felt the sting of losing everything. He was always proving himself, not to others, but to the ghost of the man he used to be, and to the silent, unyielding judge inside his own head. He built his life back, piece by piece, with the same methodical precision he applied to an engine. But the foundation was different now. It was built on grit, on the absolute certainty that if he stopped pushing, stopped working, it would all crumble again. And sometimes, in the dead of night, after a particularly grueling day, that fear would crawl out from under the bed, whispering promises of failure, reminding him of how easy it was to fall. The fear he felt now, hunched over an engine in the pre-dawn quiet, was a pale echo of the terror that had consumed him years ago, when the world he'd taken for granted simply ceased to exist. It wasn't a slow, gentle fade. It was a detonation. One late afternoon, the phone rang, a number he recognized but rarely saw, the family lawyer. His voice, usually smooth and reassuring, was thin, strained. The market had shifted, he explained, with the detached precision of a surgeon delivering a grim diagnosis. The poor investments, the risky gambles hidden behind quarterly reports, they'd all come home to roost. A final, catastrophic plummet, and the whole edifice, generations of inherited comfort, had imploded. Everything. The sprawling estate, the trust funds, the portfolios, even the very name attached to the collapsing enterprise, all were drowning under a tide of debt. Hector stood there, the receiver growing slick in his palm, the lawyer's dry monotone detailing foreclosures, liabilities, nothing salvageable. The solid ground beneath his feet had been yanked away. He was suddenly, terrifyingly weightless. That night, in the grand, echoing silence of what was still technically his bedroom, the opulent surroundings felt like a costume he could no longer wear. He lay awake, staring at the elaborate plasterwork on the ceiling until 3 a.m. bled a bruised purple light into the room. Every shadow seemed to mock him, every expensive fabric a cruel reminder. He saw it all with brutal clarity. The empty future, the profound shame, the utter helplessness. Not just the money, though that was a gaping maw, but the years he'd wasted, the soft hands that had never truly worked, the unearned confidence that had puffed him up like a child's balloon. He was 48, adrift and utterly unprepared. A spoiled boy in a man's body, facing a world he'd always believed he was above, a world he now realized he knew nothing about. The fear was a cold, constricting band around his chest. What now? He had no answer. Only the crushing, raw truth. He was nobody, and he had absolutely nothing. He felt the cold shock of it, a physical blow, as if the ground had indeed opened up beneath him. Mr. Finch, the family lawyer, delivered the verdict with a tired, almost pitying drone. It wasn't one bad bet. It was a decade of complacent management, arrogant assumptions, and aggressive, ill-advised gambles in volatile markets. The old money managers, out of touch, had bet everything. The market, merciless and indifferent, had swallowed it whole. Every cent of the trust, the holding companies, the sprawling real estate, all leveraged, collateralized, all gone. The antique brass phone in Hector's hand, solid moments ago, felt like a feather, then like a stone. He pressed it to his ear, listening to the monotonous hum of the dial tone, a cruel counterpoint to the thunderclap in his mind. Gone, all of it. The word echoed hollow in his skull. This house was already slated for an accelerated sale, its proceeds a drop in the ocean of debt. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from an internal tremor that threatened to shake him apart. He moved through the now-echoing rooms of the house he no longer owned, a ghost in his own life. The ornate furniture, the polished wood, the silenced grand piano in the living room, each object a monument to a life that had dissolved into mist. Sleep was a cruel joke. He found himself in the study, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, the ice long melted, staring out at the manicured lawn bathed in moonlight. It was 3 a.m. The world was quiet save for the frantic thumping of his own heart. He saw himself in the reflective glass of the window. A man approaching 50, with soft hands, a slightly pampered softness around his middle, and a vacant stare that mirrored the emptiness inside. He was nothing but a sum of his inheritances, a passenger on a luxury liner that had just struck an iceberg. The shame burned hotter than the whiskey. He'd scoffed at working men, in his youth with their calloused hands and their early mornings, dismissing their struggles as something beneath him, something for the unlucky. Now he was the unlucky one, but without their skills, without their grit, without their understanding of how the world truly functioned. His father's voice, a ghost from the past, whispered in his ear. A man provides Hector. He builds, he maintains. But Hector had only ever received. He hadn't built a damn thing in his life, not a single brick, not a single honest dollar. He'd managed portfolios, yes, but even that was just shuffling other people's money, a glorified game of Monopoly with real consequences he'd always been insulated from. He thought he was smart. He thought he was successful. He was just comfortable. And comfort, he now realized with a gut-wrenching lurch, had been the most insidious enemy of all. It had dulled his edges, softened his will, blinded him to the world's sharp realities. He felt a profound self-loathing, a deep disgust for the man he had become, or rather, the man he had failed to become. The sun began its slow, inevitable climb, painting the sky with sickly oranges and grays that mocked his inner turmoil. Hector watched it, the empty glass heavy in his hand, and a stillness settled over him. It wasn't peace, it was something harder, colder. Enough. The word wasn't shouted, not even thought with any particular force. It just was. Enough of the self-pity, enough of the regret, enough of staring into the abyss. He didn't know what came next. He didn't have a plan or a skill or even a glimmer of hope for a path forward. But he knew with a certainty that sliced through the fog of his despair that he couldn't keep doing this. This passive surrender to destitution. This agonizing wait for the next blow. Something had to change, and since no one else was coming to save him, it had to be him. That quiet, grim decision was the first true seed of something new. The next morning, or what passed for morning after a sleepless night, Hector found himself staring at the old, dusty toolbox in the garage. His father's toolbox, inherited but rarely touched, a relic from a time when men actually fixed things. Inside lay wrenches, screwdrivers, a hammer, simple tools he'd always paid someone else to use. A broken faucet in the downstairs bathroom had been dripping for months, an annoying inconvenience he'd never bothered with. Now it felt like a challenge, a small, ridiculous battle he could actually fight. His hands, still unaccustomed to anything more strenuous than signing a check, fumbled with the wrench. The cold metal felt foreign, awkward. He watched a YouTube video on his phone, the screen cracked, detailing the steps. Disconnect the supply lines, loosen the nuts, replace the cartridge. It sounded simple. It wasn't. The pipes were corroded, the nuts seized. He grunted, strained, sweat beading on his forehead as he twisted, pushed, pulled. His knuckles scraped against rough metal, a sharp pain reminding him he was actually doing something. He swore under his breath, frustration mounting, the familiar urge to simply give up and call someone else rising like bile. This was stupid. This was beneath him. He was supposed to be in a board room, not wrestling with rusted plumbing. But then the quiet, "Enough," echoed in his mind. No, not anymore. He remembered the countless times he'd paid exorbitant sums for minor repairs, times he'd scoffed at men who spent their days elbow-deep in grease. Now he was that man, or trying to be. The shame of his past life mingled with a grudging determination. He tightened his grip, leaned into it, felt the muscles in his arm protest. With a final, desperate heave, the nut finally gave way with a screech and a groan. He almost dropped the wrench, but he didn't. He kept going, following the on-screen instructions, his brow furrowed in concentration. It took him 3 hours, 2 trips to the hardware store for a specific washer, and a steady stream of muttered curses, but when he finally turned the water back on, the drip was gone. A small victory, almost imperceptible in the grand scheme of his shattered life, but the silence of the now-fixed faucet was a profound kind of peace. His hands ached, his back protested, but there was a strange, unfamiliar satisfaction settling deep in his bones. It was the satisfaction of building something, of fixing something, of relying solely on his own effort. It was a single, hard-won step away from the comfortable, complacent past. The quiet satisfaction of the fixed faucet didn't last. By day 3, the novelty had worn thin, replaced by a dull ache in his lower back and a phantom throb in his knuckles. He decided to tackle the perpetually jammed garage door, a problem he'd thrown money at for years, only for it to return like a bad penny. Now, with a wrench in hand and a knot of wires staring back at him, the frustration felt heavier, sharper. The mechanism groaned, refused to budge, and after an hour of wrestling, a small, crucial-looking spring snapped free, bouncing across the concrete floor and disappearing under a stack of old tires. Damn it all! Hector muttered, kicking at a loose piece of gravel. His breath hitched. This was stupid. He was spending precious hours breaking things and getting nowhere. His mind flashed to the easy days, the quick call to the repairman, the problem solved with a swipe of a card and barely a thought. He could feel the old self, the soft, comfortable Hector, sneering from the shadows of his memory. Look at you. Pathetic. What good is all that inherited wisdom now, eh? Crouched, grunting, painstakingly searching for the lost spring. His fingers, still soft from a lifetime of paperwork, were already abraded and grimy. He found it eventually, a tiny, insignificant piece of metal, yet essential. And in that moment, something shifted. The anger didn't vanish, but it twisted, became something else, a cold, stubborn resolve. He wouldn't give up. Not because he particularly enjoyed this, but because the alternative was simply letting it all rot. He spent another 2 hours, consulting shaky YouTube videos on his phone, his brow furrowed in concentration, before the door finally, shudderingly, moved up and down on command. It wasn't perfect, still a bit stiff, but it worked. And it was his work. By day 7, the glamour of self-reliance had faded completely, replaced by a grueling monotony. He'd moved from home repairs to the car in the driveway, a clunky sedan he'd kept as a backup, which now needed a new alternator. This was a bigger beast, an engine compartment, a labyrinth of hoses and belts, far beyond anything he'd ever contemplated touching. He'd spent a full afternoon just trying to identify the right part, his internet searches riddled with terms he barely understood. Alternator, power steering pump, what the hell is a serpentine belt? He mumbled, poring over a faded diagram. The manual was useless, written for professionals, not a former finance executive turned reluctant shade tree mechanic. He felt the familiar pull of despair, the gnawing anxiety that he was simply not cut out for this. He was a man of numbers, of strategy, not dirt and oil. His back ached constantly, his hands were perpetually stained, and the small cuts and nicks were a constant reminder of his clumsiness. He thought about calling a garage. Just one phone call. Explain his situation. Maybe they'd cut him a deal knowing he was down on his luck. But the words caught in his throat. The shame, the quiet, unshakable shame of admitting he couldn't even fix his own car. He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cold metal of the car fender. The illusion of a quick fix, of someone else bailing him out, was a dangerous comfort he couldn't afford anymore. He wouldn't let himself retreat into that soft space. He pulled out the wrench again, ignoring the tremor in his hands. He'd ordered the part online, watching precious little money disappear from his account. He had to make this work. There was no backup plan now. 2 weeks bled into 2 weeks and 2 days. Hector had finally managed to get the old alternator out, after an agonizing struggle that involved stripped bolts, skinned knuckles, and a moment where he nearly threw the entire tool kit across the garage. He'd even considered just selling the car for scrap, but then he'd have no transportation, no way to even try to look for work, no freedom. The new part sat on his workbench, gleaming, mocking him with its pristine perfection. Installing it, he quickly discovered, was a whole new level of hell. The tight space, the awkward angles, the precise alignment required. He dropped a tiny washer, watched it disappear into the engine's abyss, felt a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. He slammed his palm against the fender, a loud thwack echoing in the garage. "You useless idiot!" He hissed at himself, his voice raw. He wanted to walk away. He wanted to sit down, put his head in his hands, and just let the tears come. He was tired. So incredibly tired of fighting this uphill battle against his own inadequacy, against the ghost of his comfortable past. He remembered the financial reports he used to pore over, the complex spreadsheets, the high-stakes decisions. He felt powerful then, in control. Now a simple engine part felt like an insurmountable obstacle. He thought of his former colleagues, sipping expensive coffee in climate-controlled offices discussing market trends. And here he was, sweating in a dusty garage, a greasy rag clenched in his fist, utterly alone. He actually did walk away for a moment, out into the small, overgrown backyard, gulping down the cool evening air. He stared at the bruised sky, the first stars beginning to prick through. He felt a profound sense of loss, a deep well of self-pity threatening to swallow him whole. But then the quiet voice, the one born of his recent, "Enough!" pushed through the fog. "You can quit now, Hector. You can just let it all go. But what then?" There was no answer to that question that didn't involve returning to the shame, to the helplessness. He looked back at the garage, at the open hood of the car, a mechanical maw waiting to be sated. He was exhausted, frustrated, and deeply unsure. But he also knew with a certainty that settled in his bones that he couldn't stop. Not now, not when he was this close. He walked back inside, picked up a magnetic retriever, and began the tedious search for the lost washer, one scraped knuckle, one gritted tooth, one stubborn breath at a time. This wasn't about the car anymore. It was about proving to himself that he wouldn't break. Not again. He found the washer eventually, nestled in a crevice he'd sworn he'd already checked a dozen times. The tiny victory felt disproportionately large, a small flag planted on a conquered peak. He finished the repair that night long after the other garages in the area had darkened. The engine coughed to life with a satisfying rumble, and Hector, for the first time in a long time, felt a flicker of something beyond mere relief. It was competence. It was pride. Days bled into weeks. The 5 a.m. alarm still screamed its summons, but Hector didn't drag himself out of bed quite so heavily. He still faced the same grime, the same tight budgets, the same endless procession of sputtering engines and worn-out brakes. But something in his approach had subtly, fundamentally changed. He stopped seeing each broken component as a fresh wound in his own ruined life and started seeing it as a puzzle, a challenge. Old man Tiber, who ran the auto parts store down the street, was the first to notice. Tiber had seen 1,000 desperate men come through his doors, all with that same look in their eyes, defeated, hurried, just trying to get by. But Hector lately was different. He still moved with a quiet efficiency, but there was a new precision in his questions, a focused intensity that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just asking for a spark plug for a '98 Civic. He was asking about specific gaps, about material tolerances, about the subtle differences between manufacturers. "You're getting particular, Hector," Tiber grumbled one afternoon, handing over a box of brake pads. He said it with a smirk, but there was a hint of respect in his tone. Hector just grunted, hefting the box. "Learning the craft, Tiber." He didn't explain that the craft was teaching him more than just mechanics. It was teaching him patience, problem-solving, and the deep, quiet satisfaction of a job done not just adequately, but well. He began to understand the intricate dance of gears and pistons, the logic in the wiring diagrams, the inherent poetry in a perfectly balanced engine. He spent evenings not just fixing cars, but reading manuals, watching online tutorials, trying to understand why things failed, not just how to patch them up. A few more weeks trickled by, each one building on the last. His hands, once soft and accustomed to merely signing papers, were now calloused, scarred, and surprisingly dexterous. He could feel the slight drag in a bearing, hear the nascent whine of a failing belt, diagnose a subtle misfire just by the scent of the exhaust. He was becoming, against all odds, a truly good mechanic. His reputation started to precede him quietly through the neighborhood. People started asking for Hector specifically, not just the guy at the garage. One Saturday, a young woman brought in an old minivan, sputtering and barely clinging to life. Her eyes were wide with worry, talking about her 3 kids and how she couldn't afford a new car. Hector listened, truly listened, then spent the better part of the day tracing the complex issues. He didn't just fix it. He showed her what went wrong, explained how to avoid it in the future, and even gave her tips for basic maintenance. When she picked it up, her gratitude was genuine, spilling over in a way that money could never match. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Hector's lips as she drove away, a warm feeling blossoming in his chest that had nothing to do with profit. He started keeping his garage cleaner, organizing his tools with an almost obsessive precision. Each wrench had its place, each spare part its bin. It wasn't just about efficiency anymore. It was about respect for his workspace, for his tools, for the work itself. His small house, once just a place to sleep, began to feel like a fortress built by his own hands, maintained by his own effort. He still missed the grand, sprawling estate, the effortless ease of inherited wealth sometimes. But the ache was duller now, replaced by a sturdier, more grounded contentment. Looking at his hands now, grime embedded under his fingernails, skin scored with old cuts and fresh grease, he no longer saw the symbols of his fall. He saw the tools of his rebuilding. He saw the marks of honest labor, the proof of his resilience. The weight of his past failures hadn't vanished entirely, but it no longer crushed him. Instead, it had been transmuted into a kind of quiet strength, a bedrock beneath his feet. He had lost everything material, yes. But in the grinding, sweating, frustrating process of earning his daily bread, he had gained something far more precious. Himself. He knew who Hector was unequivocally, and it was a man he could finally respect. He wasn't just surviving, he was building. And that, he realized, was a kind of true wealth no market crash could ever touch. Hector still worked his long hours, still got grease under his nails, still woke with the dawn, but the grind felt different. It wasn't a penance anymore, it was a privilege. He moved with a new kind of economy, a quiet confidence that settled deep into his bones. The frantic worry about next month's bills had been replaced by a steady resolve, a belief in his own hands and his own mind to meet whatever came. One blustery Tuesday, a beat-up old Ford F-150 pulled into his bay, sputtering like a dying dog. Out stepped a kid, maybe 22, with worry etched on his face like he'd been carrying it since birth. "Mr. Hector," he started, twisting his cap, "my pop said you're the only one who could maybe look at this thing. Says it's got a ghost in the engine. And well, I ain't got much to pay, but I gotta get it running. It's for my construction job." Hector nodded slowly, peering under the hood, not with judgment, but with an almost paternal understanding. He saw the kid's desperation, the weight of responsibility for a truck that was more than just metal. It was a livelihood. The old Hector, the one who measured worth in bank balances, might have quoted a steep price or simply turned away the kid with the thin wallet. But this Hector, he saw an echo of his own journey, the struggle to stand on your own 2 feet. "Ghost, huh?" Hector grunted, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Sounds like it needs an exorcism, not just a tune-up." He spent the better part of the afternoon on that truck, methodically checking lines, testing components, listening intently to the engine's troubled song. He found a hairline crack in a manifold, a tricky little thing that played hell with the sensors. It was a tough fix, requiring patience and a steady hand. He charged the kid barely enough to cover the part, explaining clearly what he'd done, what to watch out for. The kid's gratitude was something tangible, more valuable than any fat check Hector had ever signed in his past life. "Thank you, Mr. Hector," the young man stammered, shaking his hand with a vigor that surprised him. You saved me, saved my job." As the kid drove off, the truck rumbling with a healthy purr, Hector leaned against the workbench, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked around his small, orderly garage at the wrenches hanging in their proper places, at the worn but solid floor beneath his feet. He used to think money was everything. He'd lived a life where money was a cushion, a shield, an invisible hand that smoothed every rough edge. He'd called that comfort. He thought about the sprawling mansion, the polished mahogany, the endless ease. He'd lost it all, every last cent, every brick, every memory of that life of effortless comfort. And it had hurt God how it had hurt. He felt like a man stripped bare, standing naked in a freezing wind. But in losing it, he'd found something else. "Turns out," he murmured to the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, a wry smile gracing his lips, "it's just paper or digits on a screen. Easy come, easy go." He picked up a wrench, feeling the cool, solid weight of it in his palm. Real wealth, that's what you build yourself, with sweat and smarts. He tapped his temple, then looked at his calloused hands. It's knowing you can lose every damn thing you ever thought you had and still stand tall, still find your feet, still build something true. That's comfort. That's the only kind that lasts. He stood there for a long moment, the quiet shop his sanctuary, his monument to a life forged anew. He wasn't the rich man he once was, not by any